Life has a cruel way of lulling you into a sense of security before it shatters the illusion. For years I thought I had it all: a thriving career, a sprawling house in the suburbs, and Emily, my beautiful wife, who seemed to be the perfect partner. We met in our late 20s, and from the moment we locked eyes, it felt like destiny. She was smart, confident, and had a laugh that could make anyone feel like the funniest person in the room. When we married, I promised to give her everything she wanted. And I did. Vacations in the Bahamas, a diamond necklace for her 30th birthday, and even a fully furnished art studio when she mentioned wanting to explore painting. Nothing was too much for Emily. She deserved it all, or so I thought. Our life together had a rhythm. I ran my business empire, a venture I'd built from scratch, while Emily worked as an executive assistant for a luxury real estate firm. She claimed she wanted to maintain her independence, and I admired that about her. She wasn't the type to sit idly by. At least, that's what I told myself. Things started to shift about a year ago. It wasn't dramatic, not at first. Emily began staying late at the office more often, always claiming last-minute deadlines or special projects. "Richard relies on me so much," she'd say, her tone carrying just the faintest hint of pride. Richard was her boss, a man I had met a handful of times at company events. Charming, successful, with an easy charisma that made him the life of the party. I didn't think much of him beyond a polite handshake and a passing nod. But then there were the little things. Emily's phone, once casually left on the kitchen counter, was now glued to her side, face down more often than not. Her laughter, light and musical, became a sound I heard less and less, at least when we were together. I'd find her smiling at her screen, but when I asked what was so funny, she'd brush it off. "Just something silly from work," she'd say, her voice tinged with impatience. I convinced myself I was overthinking. After all, I was busy too. My business was expanding, and I had meetings that stretched late into the night. We were both just caught up in our worlds, I thought. This was the price of success: sacrifices in the little moments, trusting that the foundation was strong enough to hold. But cracks were forming, and I didn't see them until it was too late. The first real blow came one evening when I returned home from a late meeting. Emily wasn't there. I called her, and she answered on the third ring, her voice oddly breathless. "Sorry, I'm still at the office," she said quickly. "Richard needed me to prep for tomorrow's presentation." That was the first time I felt it, a pang of something I couldn't name. Suspicion? Doubt? I shook it off, chalking it up to the stress of a long day. But it happened again. And again. One night she came home hours after dinner, her hair slightly disheveled and her lipstick smeared. She barely acknowledged me as she slipped into the bathroom, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. When she emerged, I asked her how work had been. "Fine," she said curtly, avoiding my gaze. The tension between us grew. I tried to address it once, suggesting we plan a weekend getaway to reconnect. Emily dismissed the idea, claiming her schedule was too packed. "Maybe next month," she said without looking up from her phone. Next month turned into never. The breaking point came on an ordinary Wednesday night. Emily was in the shower, and her phone buzzed on the counter. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but something about the way she had practically sprinted upstairs after arriving home made my gut twist. I hesitated for a moment, then picked up the phone. It was unlocked, a small mercy, though it felt like a betrayal just holding it. The screen displayed a message from a name that made my heart drop: Richard. "Can't stop thinking about earlier. You're incredible." My vision blurred. My hand gripped the phone so tightly I thought it might crack. I scrolled up, reading more messages. Flirty exchanges, inside jokes, and explicit descriptions of their encounters. The timestamps told me everything I needed to know. She hadn't been working late, she'd been with him. By the time I heard the water shut off, I had seen enough. I put the phone back where I found it and sat in the living room, my mind racing. When Emily came downstairs, she acted as though nothing was wrong. She kissed me on the cheek, her damp hair smelling of lavender shampoo. "I'm heading to bed," she said casually. I stared at her, barely able to summon a response. All right, I managed, my voice hollow. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, the weight of her betrayal crushing me. Memories of our life together played in my mind, each one tainted by the knowledge of what she'd done. The next morning, I made a call to Martin, a private investigator I had worked with before on business matters. If Emily wanted to lie, I would uncover the full extent of the truth. Martin worked quickly. Within days he had gathered enough evidence to confirm what I already knew. Photos of Emily entering a luxury hotel, records of extravagant dinners paid for with Richard's credit card, and even more texts that made my stomach churn. It was no longer just an affair. It was a betrayal of every vow we'd taken, every promise we'd made. And as I pieced together the extent of her deceit, one thought burned in my mind: they both thought I was a fool. What Emily didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that Richard's success had a secret benefactor. Me. I owned 51% of the shares in his firm, a fact I had kept private for strategic reasons. That gave me control not only over Richard's career but his entire company. Emily thought she had outsmarted me. Richard thought he was untouchable. They were both about to learn just how wrong they were. The morning after discovering Emily's betrayal, I stood in my office, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city skyline. My mind wasn't on the bustling streets below but on the web of lies that had unraveled in front of me. Emily thought she was clever. Richard, too. But they didn't know the full extent of what I controlled, the power I wielded. I wasn't just some overworked husband or a passive shareholder. I was the man behind the scenes, the architect of Richard's success. He didn't just work for me. His entire company survived because of my investments, my strategies. By lunchtime, I had devised a plan that would not only expose their deceit but dismantle the fragile empires they thought they'd built. It began with Richard. A week after confirming the affair, I called my legal team into my office. Sitting across from me was Margaret, my trusted corporate lawyer. She was sharp, efficient, and unrelenting, qualities I needed now more than ever. I want a complete audit of the real estate firm, I said, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were financial discrepancies Martin had uncovered during his investigation. Richard wasn't just sleeping with my wife, he was funneling company funds into personal luxuries. Expensive watches, trips abroad, and five-star dinners, all disguised as business expenses. Margaret raised an eyebrow. This will cause waves, Adam. Are you prepared for what comes next? I leaned back in my chair, my jaw tight. I'm counting on it. Within days, Margaret's team unearthed enough dirt to launch a full-scale internal review. Employees were questioned, records were subpoenaed, and whispers of corporate fraud began to circulate. Richard, oblivious to the storm brewing around him, continued his affair with Emily, no doubt reveling in his perceived invincibility. While the audit unfolded, I focused on Emily. Her behavior remained unchanged, as though the guilt of betrayal had never touched her. She continued to leave for work earlier than necessary, return home late, and spend hours texting on her phone. Watching her play the role of the devoted wife was almost comical now. But I didn't confront her, not yet. I wanted her to feel safe, to think her lies were still intact. Every smile she offered me, every dismissive excuse, only fueled my resolve. On a particularly quiet Sunday afternoon, Emily lounged on the couch, scrolling through her phone. Her laughter, once my favorite sound, now grated on my nerves. I was thinking we should plan a trip, I said casually, testing her reaction. She barely looked up. A trip? Where? Europe, maybe. A few weeks away to reconnect. Her fingers froze on her phone. I'll have to check with work, she said, her voice lacking conviction. I smiled, masking my disdain. Of course. Let me know. I didn't need her to confirm what I already knew. She wouldn't agree because Richard wouldn't allow it. 2 weeks later, Richard's empire began to crumble. The audit findings were damning. Fraud, mismanagement, and misuse of funds, it was all there in black and white. I attended the company's emergency board meeting, sitting silently as Richard squirmed under the scrutiny of his peers. He still didn't know I was the one pulling the strings. At the height of the meeting, I stood. As the majority shareholder, I can't ignore these findings, I said, my voice calm but firm. Effective immediately, Richard will step down as CEO while we conduct further investigations. The room erupted into murmurs. Richard's face turned pale, then red with fury. You can't do this, he barked, standing from his chair. I can't, I replied coldly. And I just did. I walked out of the room, leaving him to face the fallout. By the end of the week, his accounts were frozen, his reputation tarnished, and his position destroyed. Emily was next. It was a Friday evening when I executed the final phase of my plan. I came home early, a rare occurrence, catching Emily by surprise. She was dressed to the nines, her makeup flawless and her perfume strong enough to fill the entire foyer. Big plans tonight? I asked, feigning ignorance. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward her phone. Just dinner with the girls. Ah, I said, nodding. Sounds fun. I watched her leave, the sound of her heels clicking against the marble floor echoing in the silence. An hour later, I arrived at the hotel where Martin had tracked her. I parked across the street and waited, my hands steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. At 9:15 p.m., Emily emerged from the elevator arm in arm with Richard. They laughed, oblivious to the camera lens capturing every moment. When they entered the hotel bar, I walked in after them, positioning myself at a nearby table. They didn't see me. They didn't see the photographer either. The images were perfect, Emily leaning into Richard, her hand grazing his cheek, their stolen kisses in the dim light of the bar. By the time they returned to the elevator, I had everything I needed. That night, Emily came home late, her lipstick faded and her hair slightly tousled. She didn't bother with an excuse, simply murmuring good night as she slipped upstairs. I sat in the living room, staring at the evidence on my phone. It was over now. I had everything, the financial records, the photos, and the undeniable truth of her betrayal. But instead of confronting her immediately, I waited. I wanted her to see the life she'd destroyed crumble before her eyes. I wanted her to feel the weight of her choices, the consequences she never thought would catch up to her. The next morning, I sent the photos to Richard with a simple message. You're done. By the end of the day, he was. The message to Richard was only the beginning. I had no intention of letting him slither away from the wreckage. If he thought being fired as CEO was the worst of it, he was gravely mistaken. His affair with Emily wasn't just a betrayal of me. It was an insult to everything I had built. By Monday morning, Richard's downfall was public knowledge. The media was ablaze with headlines about the scandal at his firm, complete with leaks of the audit results. Every outlet had the same damning narrative: corporate fraud, misappropriation of funds, and gross negligence under his leadership. I made sure my PR team handled the fallout perfectly. While the media tore him apart, I positioned myself as the savior of the company, stepping in to protect its employees and restructure its leadership. It was poetic in a way. I had built the company, let him think he was running it, and now I would reclaim it entirely. Emily, oblivious to the storm brewing, continued her charade at home. She moved through our house with the grace of someone who thought she had mastered the art of deception. Every lie she told, every moment she acted like the perfect wife, was a reminder of the mask she wore. I played my part too, pretending not to notice her nervous glances at her phone or the way she avoided eye contact. But the cracks in her confidence were beginning to show. One evening, as we sat at opposite ends of the couch, I casually mentioned, "I saw Richard's name in the news today." Emily froze, her hand gripping her wine glass. "Oh?" she said, trying to sound indifferent. "What about?" "Some financial troubles at the company. Fraud, I think." I kept my tone neutral, watching her carefully. Her lips tightened, but she forced a shrug. "I haven't heard anything about that. Must have been after I left the office." Her lies were almost amusing at this point. Almost. 2 weeks later, I sent Emily to the same firm where Richard had been photographed with her. She thought she was attending a routine charity gala, a work obligation she could dress up as. Professional networking. I encouraged her to go, even suggested a new dress for the occasion. What she didn't know was that the venue was crawling with reporters and photographers, all primed to capture every moment of her evening. I made sure they knew exactly where to position themselves, who to follow, and what to look for. That night, as Emily left the house, I leaned against the doorframe, watching her drive off. My mind was already racing ahead to the next stage of my plan. The photos and videos surfaced within hours, Emily and Richard together, his arm around her waist as they shared champagne. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Disgraced CEO caught with married employee amid scandal. The next morning, Emily woke up to chaos. Her phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages. When she saw the photos, her face went pale. She turned to me, clutching her phone. "Adam," she stammered, "this isn't what it looks like." I raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. "What does it look like, Emily?" Her lips parted, but no words came out. She must have realized there was no excuse she could give that I hadn't already disproven. "Let me save you the trouble," I said, my voice calm but cold. I placed a folder on the kitchen counter and slid it toward her. "Inside you'll find the texts, the photos, the hotel receipts, all of it." Emily hesitated before opening the folder. As she flipped through the pages, her face crumpled. "You had me followed?" she whispered. "I had to," I replied. "Because you wouldn't tell me the truth." She sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she held the evidence of her betrayal. "I can explain," she began, but I cut her off. "I don't want an explanation. I want you out of this house by tonight." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. "Adam, please. Don't do this. We can fix this. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" I said, my voice rising. "A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk. You didn't make a mistake, Emily. You made a choice." Over and over again. Tears streamed down her face, but they didn't move me. I had cried my own tears long before this moment. Richard's life, meanwhile, was in ruins. The photos of him with Emily only added fuel to the fire. His wife filed for divorce, his assets were frozen, and his name became synonymous with scandal. By the time my legal team was done with him, he had nothing left. I had hoped to never hear from him again, but desperation makes people bold. He called me one afternoon, his voice a mix of anger and pleading. "Adam, we need to talk," he said. "About what?" I asked, keeping my tone icy. "You know about Emily and me," he began. "But this is going too far. My career is destroyed. My family." "Your family?" I interrupted. "You destroyed your family the moment you decided to betray me." There was silence on the other end. Then, a defeated sigh. "I didn't know she was your wife." I laughed bitterly. "Does that make it better?" Richard had no answer, and I didn't care to hear his excuses. I hung up, satisfied knowing he was finally experiencing the consequences of his arrogance. That evening, Emily packed her bags. She pleaded with me one last time as she stood by the door, tears staining her cheeks. "Adam, I made a mistake," she said. "I love you. Please don't throw everything away." I met her gaze, my expression unflinching. "You threw it away, Emily. Not me." As the door closed behind her, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The first phase of my revenge was complete, but my plan was far from over. Emily's life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. It didn't take long for the cracks in Emily's new life to show. After leaving our house, she moved into a small apartment across town. It was a far cry from the sprawling home she had grown accustomed to. Gone were the designer furniture, the luxury bathroom fixtures, and the oversized walk-in closet. She had traded it all for peeling wallpaper, a leaky faucet, and a mattress on the floor. Her relationship with Richard, predictably, didn't survive the fallout. The public exposure of their affair had obliterated whatever fantasy they had built together. With his wealth frozen and his reputation in tatters, Richard was no longer the charming, powerful man she had fallen for. He became bitter and paranoid, lashing out at anyone who reminded him of his downfall. Including Emily. Within weeks, she was alone. I wasn't finished with her yet. While Emily tried to piece together her new life, I was busy crafting her next chapter. By now I had moved on, though not in the way she might have expected. I had started seeing someone, a woman named Grace. Unlike Emily, Grace didn't care about status or appearances. She was warm, down-to-earth, and fiercely independent. She worked in retail, managing one of the grocery stores I owned through a chain of businesses I had invested in. It was through Grace that I came up with my next move. Emily had been job hunting for weeks with little success. Her connection to the scandal made her unemployable in the corporate world. Nobody wanted to hire the ex-mistress of a disgraced CEO, especially one with a reputation for deception. Desperate, she finally applied to one of the only places that would take her, a cashier position at Grace's grocery store. When I saw her name on the applicant list, I almost laughed. It was poetic. Grace and I discussed it, and while she wasn't thrilled about the idea of employing my ex-wife, I assured her it would be worth it. I told her to hire Emily. Not as a favor, but as a means to an end. Emily's first day on the job was a study in humility. She stood behind the register, scanning groceries with a strained smile while customers barely acknowledged her existence. This wasn't the Emily who once sipped champagne at charity galas or flaunted her designer wardrobe at upscale restaurants. This was a woman forced to confront the consequences of her choices. The irony wasn't lost on me when I visited the store one afternoon. I walked in with Grace, my arm around her waist, as we casually browsed the aisles. Emily spotted us immediately. Her face paled, her hands trembling as she rang up a customer's items. When it was our turn at the register, I gave her a polite smile. "Hello, Emily," I said. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Adam." Grace leaned closer to me, her smile sweet but pointed. "Oh, you know her?" I chuckled softly. "We have history." The transaction was painfully slow. Emily fumbled with the scanner, dropping one of our items in her haste. Grace watched with quiet amusement, clearly enjoying the awkward tension. "Careful," Grace said, her tone light but laced with mock sympathy. "Wouldn't want you to make a mistake, now would we?" Emily didn't respond. She avoided eye contact as she handed me the receipt, her fingers brushing mine briefly before recoiling. "Thank you, Emily," I said. "You're doing a great job." The weeks that followed were a slow, calculated dismantling of whatever pride Emily had left. I visited the store frequently, sometimes alone, sometimes with Grace. Each time, I made sure to stop at her register, offering polite but pointed remarks about her work. "Looks like you're settling in nicely," I'd say. Or, "Hard work builds character, doesn't it?" Emily never retaliated. She couldn't afford to. This job was her last chance to stay afloat, and she knew it. Behind the scenes, I made sure her life remained difficult. I didn't sabotage her work. I wasn't cruel without purpose. But I ensured she stayed firmly grounded in her new reality. Her hours were long, her pay barely enough to cover rent, and her coworkers, aware of her past, kept her at arm's length. Every day, she was reminded of what she had lost. One evening, after closing the store, Emily sat in her car, staring at the steering wheel. She looked exhausted, her once radiant beauty dulled by stress and regret. I watched from a distance, parked a few rows away. For a fleeting moment, I considered walking over, offering some kind of truce. After all, revenge had been served, and the satisfaction it brought was undeniable. But as I sat there, I remembered the nights I had spent alone, the lies she had told, and the trust she had shattered. No, I thought. She deserved this. As Emily drove away, I turned the key in my own ignition. My new life with Grace was just beginning, and Emily's chapter in my story was finally coming to an end. Emily's fall was complete, and I had moved on. My life with Grace became a stark contrast to the chaos Emily had left behind. Where my marriage to Emily had been filled with appearances and shallow affection, my relationship with Grace was built on something deeper. She was kind and grounded, the kind of woman who didn't need the extravagance that Emily once demanded. Our relationship wasn't rushed. Grace had been cautious about dating me, aware of my recent divorce and the messy circumstances surrounding it. But as weeks turned into months, we found a rhythm together, a life far simpler yet infinitely more fulfilling than anything I'd known before. I saw Emily occasionally at the grocery store. Each encounter was a quiet reminder of how far she had fallen. She'd lost the sharp edge of defiance that once defined her. Now she looked tired, her posture hunched as if carrying the weight of her decisions. One afternoon, as Grace and I walked through the store hand in hand, we noticed Emily in the break room. The door was slightly ajar, and we heard her muffled voice on the phone. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she said, her tone filled with desperation. "The rent's overdue, and I can't. I just can't." I paused, Grace's hand in mine. For a moment, I felt a flicker of something, pity maybe? But it was quickly extinguished by the memory of what she had done. Grace glanced at me, her expression unreadable. "You don't have to listen," she said softly. I nodded, pulling her away from the door. Emily's struggles weren't my concern anymore. My business ventures continued to flourish, though I had become more selective about where I invested my time and energy. I no longer felt the need to chase every opportunity or prove myself to anyone. Perhaps it was Grace's influence. Her calm, pragmatic approach to life had taught me the value of contentment. But there was one loose end I couldn't ignore, ensuring Richard would never recover. Richard's life had unraveled completely. After his dismissal, he struggled to find work, his reputation permanently tarnished by the scandal. The last I heard, he was trying to start a consulting business out of his apartment, but even that venture had failed. His wife had divorced him, taking their children and most of his remaining assets. One day, I received an email from him, a desperate plea for a meeting. "Adam, I know I don't deserve your time, but I need to explain myself. Please, just one meeting. I have nothing left to lose." For a moment, I considered ignoring it. But curiosity got the better of me. I agreed to meet him, choosing a public place to ensure the encounter remained controlled. When I arrived at the cafe, Richard was already there, seated at a corner table. He looked nothing like the confident, charismatic man I had once known. His suit was wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and his eyes hollow. "Adam," he began as I sat down. "Thank you for coming." I didn't respond, letting the silence settle between us until he squirmed. "I've lost everything," he admitted, his voice trembling. "My career, my family. I've hit rock bottom." "You did that to yourself," I said bluntly. He flinched but nodded. "I know. I know I hurt you, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I need your help. Please, just a loan. Enough to get back on my feet." I leaned back in my chair studying him. "Why would I help you, Richard? You betrayed me, stole from me, and tried to take what was mine. What makes you think you deserve anything from me?" Tears welled in his eyes. "Because I have nothing left, Adam. Nothing. I'm begging you." For a moment, I felt nothing but disgust. Richard's downfall was his own doing, and his plea for mercy rang hollow. "No," I said, finally standing up. "You made your choices. Live with them." As I walked away, I felt no guilt, only a sense of finality. Meanwhile, Grace and I grew closer. She became my partner not just in life but in business as well. Together, we expanded her grocery store chain, focusing on creating a community-driven brand that valued its employees. Grace had an uncanny ability to connect with people, and her empathy made her a natural leader. One evening, as we sat on the porch of my home, our home now, Grace turned to me. "Do you ever regret how things ended with Emily?" I thought about her question for a moment, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "No," I said finally. "She made her choices, and I made mine. What's there to regret?" Grace nodded, her hand resting on mine. "I'm glad you found your way here," she said softly. So am I replied. Emily remained at the grocery store for another year before quietly leaving. She didn't say goodbye, and I didn't ask where she went. By then, I had let go of any lingering resentment. She was a chapter in my life, a painful one, but one that had shaped me into the man I had become. As for me, life moved forward. Grace and I built something real, something lasting. And as I watched her laughing with the employees at one of our stores or discussing expansion plans late into the night, I realized that I had finally found what I had been missing all along, a partnership based on trust and respect. Emily had once been the center of my world, but now, she was just a distant memory. And that was enough. Time passed, and the remnants of my old life faded into the background. Grace and I continued to build our new life together, a foundation rooted in trust and honesty, things I had come to value more than I ever thought possible. Emily had disappeared from my radar. Occasionally, I wondered where she was or what had become of her, but those thoughts never lingered long. I was too focused on the present, on the woman who had brought warmth and stability back into my life. Still, life has a way of circling back to unresolved threads. One rainy afternoon, as I reviewed expansion plans for our grocery chain, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Normally, I'd let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Adam? A hesitant voice asked. I froze. I hadn't heard that voice in over a year, but I recognized it immediately. Emily. What do you want? I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. There was a pause on the other end. I didn't know who else to call. A part of me wanted to hang up, to leave her to whatever mess she had created for herself. But something in her voice, a mixture of desperation and resignation, stopped me. I need help, she admitted. I'm not asking for money or anything like that. I need someone to talk to. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her. We chose a neutral location, a small cafe in a quiet part of town. When I arrived, I barely recognized her. Emily looked older, worn down by life in a way that had nothing to do with age. Her once immaculate appearance was replaced by a simple outfit, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She fidgeted with her coffee cup, her eyes darting around nervously until they landed on me. Thank you for coming, she said softly. I sat down, saying nothing, waiting for her to speak. I know I'm probably the last person you want to see, she began, her voice trembling. And I don't blame you. I made mistakes, terrible ones, and I've paid for them. But I need to say this, I'm sorry, Adam. For everything. Her words hung in the air, heavy with regret. For what, exactly? I asked, my voice calm but cold. For betraying you. For lying. For ruining what we had. She looked down, her hands trembling. I thought I wanted something more, something exciting. But I was wrong. I didn't see what I had until it was gone. I leaned back in my chair studying her. And what do you expect me to do with that, Emily? Forgive you? Pretend it never happened? No, she said quickly. I don't expect anything. I needed you to know. To hear it from me. You didn't deserve what I did to you. For the first time in years, I saw a glimpse of the woman I had once loved, the vulnerability, the honesty she had buried beneath layers of deceit. And for a moment, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't expected, pity. But pity wasn't enough to erase the past. I appreciate the apology, I said finally. But it doesn't change anything. You made your choices, Emily, and I've moved on. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I know. And I'm glad you're happy. You deserve that. There was a long silence between us, the kind that only exists when there's nothing left to say. Finally she stood, wiping her eyes. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For listening. As she walked away, I felt a strange sense of closure. Her apology didn't absolve her, and it didn't heal the wounds she had caused, but it allowed me to let go of the last remnants of anger I had been holding on to. That evening, I told Grace about the meeting. She listened quietly, her hand resting on mine as I recounted the conversation. "Do you feel better?" she asked when I was done. I thought about it for a moment. I think so. It's not about forgiving her. It's about finally closing that chapter. Grace smiled, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "You're a better man than most, Adam." "No," I said, shaking my head. "I'm just a man who's learned the hard way." Life moved forward. Emily faded from my thoughts, a ghost of a past life I no longer needed to revisit. Grace and I continued to grow our business and our relationship, building something real and lasting. Looking back, I realized that Emily's betrayal had been a turning point, not just in my marriage but in my understanding of what truly mattered. Trust, honesty, and respect weren't just ideals, they were necessities. And in Grace, I had found all of that and more. The life I had lost with Emily was nothing compared to the one I had gained with Grace. With Emily's apology behind me, my life settled into a rhythm of peace I hadn't known in years. Grace and I continued to build our relationship, each day reaffirming the trust and partnership we shared. The past no longer felt like a shadow looming over me. It was simply a chapter one had closed, one I rarely thought about anymore. But life, as it often does, had one more surprise in store for me. It started with a phone call from my lawyer, Margaret. She rarely called unless something important came up, so when her number appeared on my phone, I knew to answer immediately. "Adam," she began, her voice measured, "I've received a legal inquiry that involves you indirectly." "What kind of inquiry?" I asked, my brow furrowing. "It concerns Emily," she said, pausing for a moment. "She's being sued by creditors for unpaid debts. It seems she's been in significant financial trouble for quite some time." I leaned back in my chair, letting the information sink in. Emily's struggles weren't exactly a secret, but this was the first I'd heard of legal action. "What does this have to do with me?" Margaret hesitated. "She listed you as a reference in some of the loan applications, back when you were still married. There's no direct liability on your part, but her creditors are trying to involve you, claiming she misrepresented her financial stability by associating it with your name." A bitter laugh escaped me. Even now, Emily's poor decisions were reaching into my life. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "I'll handle the legal side," Margaret assured me. "But you may want to prepare for potential fallout. If this becomes public, it could attract attention to your business." That evening, I told Grace about the situation. She listened intently, her expression calm but serious. "Do you think she did it on purpose?" Grace asked. I shook my head. "I doubt it. Emily may have been reckless, but I don't think she was trying to drag me down with her. Still, it doesn't matter. I want this resolved quickly." Grace nodded, her hand finding mine. "We'll get through it. Together." Her words, simple as they were, reminded me why I had chosen her. Grace wasn't just my partner in love, she was my partner in everything. Over the next few weeks, Margaret worked tirelessly to distance me from Emily's financial mess. She was successful in preventing any direct liability, but the situation dredged up memories I'd rather have left buried. I learned more about Emily's life than I wanted to: her failed attempts to start a consulting business, the eviction notices she had narrowly avoided, and the mounting credit card debt she couldn't pay off. It was clear she was spiraling, her life unraveling piece by piece. And while part of me felt vindicated, another part, one I didn't care to examine too closely, felt something else. Pity. One day, as I left the office, I found myself driving toward the part of town where Emily now lived. I hadn't planned it, but curiosity had a way of steering the wheel. Her apartment complex was as unremarkable as I had imagined. The buildings were old, their paint faded and peeling. Children played in the courtyard, their laughter echoing against the cracked pavement. I spotted Emily almost immediately. She was sitting on a bench, staring blankly at the ground. Her once impeccable appearance was gone. She wore a plain sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. For a moment, I considered approaching her. But what would I say? What could I say? Instead, I turned the car around and drove home. That evening, As Grace and I shared dinner, I told her about what I'd seen. She looked broken, I admitted, my fork pausing midair. Grace studied me carefully. And how does that make you feel? I don't know, I said honestly. Part of me thinks she deserves it. But another part of me wonders if you could have done something differently? Grace finished. I nodded. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just feeling guilty for not helping her now. Grace reached across the table, her hand covering mine. Adam, you gave her everything. You can't fix the choices she made after she lost it all. That's not your responsibility. Her words settled over me, a soothing balm to the conflict I hadn't realized I was still carrying. As the weeks passed, I focused on the future. Grace and I were planning a major expansion of the grocery chain, and the possibilities filled me with excitement. For the first time in years, I felt free, truly free, from the burdens of the past. And yet, Emily's plight lingered in the back of my mind. One afternoon I wrote her a letter. It wasn't an offer to help or an attempt to rekindle any kind of relationship. It was simply a final goodbye. In the letter I told her I wished her well, but that her life was her own now, just as mine was my own. I thanked her for the lessons her betrayal had taught me, painful as they were, and wished her peace in finding her way forward. I never sent it. Instead, I burned it in the fireplace, watching the flames consume the words I no longer needed to say. By the time winter rolled around, Emily had moved again. I didn't know where she went, and I didn't ask. She had become a ghost in my life, a faint shadow of a past I had long since left behind. With Grace by my side, I stepped into the future, ready to embrace whatever came next. Life is strange in how it ebbs and flows. The past may feel like a closed book, but its lessons continue to whisper, shaping decisions in ways we don't always notice. By the time Emily had faded entirely from my life, I'd realized her betrayal wasn't just an ending, it was a rebirth. Grace and I stood together, not just as partners but as equals, building something meaningful. Our grocery chain expanded to dozens of locations, each store embodying the values we both cherished: community, integrity, and trust. The irony wasn't lost on me, that the simplicity of a grocery store became the foundation for the happiness I'd sought in a lavish life with Emily. One day, I found myself reflecting on everything that had brought me here. Grace and I were walking through one of our newest stores, watching the employees bustle about, their smiles genuine as they greeted customers. I felt proud, not just of what we had built, but of how far I'd come. I leaned against a display of fresh produce, the scent of ripe strawberries filling the air. "Do you ever think about the road not taken?" I asked Grace. She tilted her head, considering my question. "Not really," she said after a moment. "I think about where we are now. And I think that's all that matters." I smiled. She was right, as always. That evening, as we sat on the porch of our home, I realized just how much peace I had found. The anger and betrayal I'd once carried were gone, replaced by something softer. Not forgiveness, exactly. Some things don't deserve forgiveness, but acceptance. Emily had made her choices, and so had I. Months later, I received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the return address caught my attention. It was from a small town 2 states over. I opened it cautiously, finding a brief, handwritten note inside. "Adam, I don't know if this will reach you, but I needed to write. Thank you for everything you gave me, even when I didn't deserve it. I've found work in a diner here, nothing glamorous, but honest. I'm trying to rebuild, and I hope one day I'll truly deserve the life I lost. Emily." I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and set it aside. I didn't feel the need to respond. The note wasn't for me, it was for her. A way for her to make peace with her past, just as I had made peace with mine. Grace found me later that evening, sitting quietly in my study. "Everything okay?" she asked, placing a hand on my shoulder. I handed her the letter, watching as her eyes scanned the page. She looked up at me, her expression thoughtful. "Do you believe her?" she asked. I shrugged. "I think she's trying. That's enough." Grace nodded, setting the letter down. It's strange how life works, isn't it? How people come and go. It is, I agreed. But the ones who matter are the ones who stay. I pulled her into a gentle embrace, the warmth of her presence grounding me. Emily was a memory now, a distant ripple in the calm waters of my life. Years later, I would think back to that chapter of my life with a sense of detachment. It was a part of my story, but not the defining part. The defining part was the moment I chose to let go. In the end, revenge didn't bring me happiness, growth did. Moving on did. And in grace, I found the future I had always deserved. As I sat on the porch of our home, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized something important. Life isn't about the betrayals or the failures, it's about what you do after them. And for me, life was just beginning.